In our last video, we looked at John Stuart Mill's discussion in On Liberty of how the harsh and dreaded censorship of middle-class society and the despotism of custom are limiting individuality in a free society. Not only does that indicate how middle-class ideals of respectability and propriety limited individual behavior and also inhibited the free expression and exchange of ideas, but also how that becomes very important for the way individuals must function in a disciplinary society in which they're constantly under the surveillance of their neighbors. And this will be an extremely important issue to look at in A Christmas Carol, Jane Eyre, Mrs. Dalloway, and Heart of Darkness. The repression of middle-class society and how that inhibits individuality and how individuals must learn to navigate this disciplinary culture. If you have not yet had an opportunity to go watch that video, I suggest you watch that one. For the rest of the semester, that will be the most important video to understand what's going on in our following texts. In this video, we're going to be looking at how John Stuart Mill modifies Jeremy Bentham's original concept of utilitarianism to make it match what he observes with the way society and humans within society actually operate. Just as Thomas Carlyle's notion of transcendentalism seems to trend toward utilitarianism, at least in his way of evaluating acts and behavior, John Stuart Mill's notion of utilitarianism tends to trend toward, if not transcendentalism, at least toward values consistent with transcendentalism in ways that make it more acceptable to middle-class society. And although John Stuart Mill's modifications of utilitarianism through the lens of popularism to make it a less rigid doctrine based upon primary observed behavior, it nevertheless also makes it in some ways more palatable to the middle class. And even those people like Dickens who attack utilitarianism ultimately end up endorsing behavior which is consistent with the way John Stuart Mill discusses proper behavior in his pamphlet Utilitarianism. But first, we're going to be looking at John Stuart Mill's autobiography and talk about how Mill himself regarded his shift from a rigid utilitarian and a follower of Jeremy Bentham to a more moderate and more popularist notion of utilitarianism, and also how he modified his evaluation of poetry from a useless exercise, which Bentham, of course, famously compared to pushpin, to a quote-unquote very culture of the feelings. But also, we need to look at how, in some ways, Mill's readmission of poetry into popular culture as an important exercise diminished its importance, diminished its centrality in ways that people like Percy Shelley or William Wordsworth, both of whom saw it as essential to human knowledge and superior to science, would never have accepted. It's a culture of the feelings, but it's not a primary means of gaining knowledge of the universe, or even in some ways of human behavior. We're going to start off by looking at Mill's autobiography and tracing how he changes his attitude toward the importance of poetry and how that change in attitude toward poetry is part of and perhaps part of the instigation for his change in attitude toward utilitarianism and Bentham's doctrines. And we're going to start our discussion of his autobiography by looking at Chapter 4, which does not appear in the Norton Anthology, but which is published on Canvas in a PDF form, and which shows us from what Mill is transitioning so that we better understand how he shifts his attitude in Chapter 5, which does appear in the Norton Anthology. In the selection from Chapter 4, Youthful Propagandism, we're going to skip down to the third paragraph, Mill's description of himself as a young Benthamite. He says, I conceive that the description so often given of a Benthamite as a mere reasoning machine, though extremely inapplicable to most of those who have been designated by that title, was during 2 or 3 years of my life not altogether untrue of me. It was perhaps as applicable to me as it can well be said to anyone just entering into life, to whom the common objects of desire must in general have at least the attraction of novelty. There is nothing very extraordinary in this fact. No youth of the age I was then can be expected to be more than one thing, and this was the thing I happened to be. Ambition and desire of distinction I had in abundance, and zeal for what I thought was the good of mankind was my strongest sentiment, mixing with and coloring all others. But my zeal was as yet little else, at that period of life, than zeal for speculative opinions. It had not its root in genuine benevolence or sympathy with mankind, though these qualities held their due place in my ethical standard. And I want to point this important point out. He says that although he felt he was zealous toward the improvement of humankind, it was really sort of humankind in the abstract, and it was not at this point based upon genuine benevolence or sympathy with mankind. In other words, he didn't really care about improving the lot of individual humans, just of humanity. Nor was it connected with any high enthusiasm for ideal nobleness. Yet, of this feeling I was imaginatively very susceptible, but there was at the time an intermission of its natural element, poetical culture, while there was a superabundance of the discipline antagonistic to it, that of mere logic and analysis. That word should actually be aliment, which means food. Add to this, as was already mentioned, my father's teachings tended to the undervaluing of feeling. It was not that he himself was cold-hearted or insensible. I believe it was rather from the contrary quality. He thought that feeling could take care of itself, that there was sure to be enough of it if actions were properly cared about. Offended by the frequency with which, in ethical and philosophical controversy, feeling is made the ultimate reason and justification of conduct, instead of being itself called on for justification, while, in practice, actions, the effect of which on human happiness is mischievous, are defended as being required by feeling. And the character of a person of feeling obtains a credit for desert, which he thought only due to actions. He had a real impatience of attributing praise to feeling, or any but the most sparing reference to it, either in the estimation of persons or in the discussion of things. So in other words, John Stuart Mill is saying that James Mill didn't believe that feelings were unimportant. He just thought that feelings themselves did not need any more help, whereas logic and analysis were undervalued and needed emphasis, and that very often people were given credit for things because of feeling, which should have been given credit only to people who actually did things. And so therefore, he wants to emphasize more on action, and also wants those who act to be able to provide a justification, a rational justification, other than just simply feeling. In addition to the influence which this characteristic in him had on me and others, we found all the opinions to which we attached the most importance constantly attacked on the ground of feeling. Utility was denounced as cold calculation, political economy as hard-hearted, anti-population doctrines as repulsive to the natural feelings of mankind. We retorted by the word sentimentality, which, along with declamation and vague generalities, served us as common terms of opprobrium. Although we were generally in the right, as against those who were opposed to us, the effect was that the cultivation of feeling, except the feelings of public and private duty, was not in much esteem among us, and had very little place in the thoughts of the most of us, myself in particular. What we principally thought of was to alter people's opinions, to make them believe according to evidence, and to know what was their real interest, which, when once they knew, they would, we thought, by the instrument of opinion, enforce a regard to it upon one another. While fully recognizing the superior excellence of unselfish benevolence, love of justice, we did not expect the regeneration of mankind from any direct action on those sentiments, but from the effect of educated intellect enlightening the selfish feelings. Mill is arguing that not only did they themselves discount feeling as a motivation for conduct, but they also found themselves attacked on the basis of being cold-hearted, when in fact they believed in their notion of human society and human behavior that the method that was most likely to enact social change was by educating people and then appealing to their reason, as opposed to attempting to influence their emotions. They believed that once they educated people where their actual self-interest lay, then they would pursue their self-interest rationally, and emotional states and desires would have nothing to do with their behavior, which resulted in their devaluation of feeling in general, both as a mode of conduct and as a mode of changing other people's conduct. And this devaluation of feeling ultimately then resulted in their devaluation of what was associated with feeling after Romantic poets, which was poetry. Remember, in the 18th century, as we talked about earlier, poetry was supposed to deal with high ideas. Poetry itself was expected to engage the intellect. But following the Romantic poets, especially following Wordsworth, Emotion and feeling were given primary significance in human behavior. And so poetry became attached to feeling, as it is indeed still now. So let's skip down to the next paragraph. From this neglect, both in theory and in practice, of the cultivation of feeling naturally resulted, among other things, an undervaluing of poetry and of imagination generally as an element of human nature. It is, or was, part of the popular notion of Benthamites that they are enemies of poetry. This was partly true of Bentham himself. He used to say that all poetry is misrepresentation. So as a result of their devaluation of feeling as a motivation for human conduct, a side effect of this was a devaluation of poetry, which was supposed to be a general expression of feeling. That brings us to chapter 5 and Mill's description of his changing attitudes toward poetry. Remember that in the previous chapter he had talked about the fact that he was motivated by an abstract desire for the improvement of human society, but not really any sort of real sympathy with human beings themselves. And that failure to develop any real sympathy with human beings, combined with his devaluation of emotion, produce his crisis in his mental history, which leads to a depression. And in fact, biographically, although medical science and psychology were not capable of recognizing it at the time, he was susceptible probably to depression and had several depressive bouts through his life. But in any case, at this point, Mill will be describing his crisis in his mental history, a bout of depression, which he attributes to his lack of developed sympathy. He says, if we skip down to the bottom, from the winter of 1821, when I first read Bentham, and especially from the commencement of the Westminster Review, I had what might truly be called an object in life, to be a reformer of the world. My conception of my own happiness was entirely identified with this object. The personal sympathies I wished for were those of my fellow laborers in this enterprise. I endeavored to pick up as many followers as I could by the way, but as a serious and permanent personal satisfaction to rest upon, my whole reliance was placed on this, and I was accustomed to felicitate myself on the certainty of a happy life which I enjoyed through placing my happiness in something durable and distant, in which some progress might always be making, while it could never be exhausted by complete attainment. Now consider that for a utilitarian, the standard by which every act is judged and the goal which one seeks to attain by that act is happiness. And so for a utilitarian like Mill, he's constantly aware of how he can achieve his own happiness, of where his self-interest lies, because that's how you judge the behavior of each individual person. So his self-conscious consideration of his own happiness is a standard that he will be paying attention to carefully. This did very well for several years, during which the general improvement going on in the world and the idea of myself as engaged with others and struggling to promote it seemed enough to fill up an interesting and animated existence. But the time came when I awakened from this as from a dream. It was in the autumn of 1826. I was in a dull state of nerves, such as everybody is occasionally liable to, unsusceptible to enjoyment or pleasurable excitement, one of those moods when what is pleasure at other times becomes insipid or indifferent, the state, I should think, in which converts to Methodism usually are when smitten by their first conviction of sin. Notice, by the way, the similarity between the state that Mill describes here and the state that Carlyle describes through Teufelsdreck in Sartor Resartus, when he is struck by the loss of faith and feels the sense of pining pusillanimous fear. In this frame of mind, it occurred to me to put the question to myself, suppose that all your objects in life were realized, that all the changes in institutions and opinions which you are looking forward to could be completely effected at this very instant. Would this be a great joy and happiness to you? And an irrepressible self-consciousness distinctly answered no. At this my heart sank within me. The whole foundation on which my life was constructed fell down. All my happiness was to have been found in the continual pursuit of this end. The end had ceased to charm, and how could there ever again be any interest in the means? I seemed to have nothing left to live for. It occurs to Mill in this state of depression to ask himself, would attaining his goal make him happy? And recognizing that obtaining his goal for other people would not make him happy in himself, he comes to believe that he has nothing to live for because he has no valuable goal which will give him satisfaction. Mill goes on to actually quote from Coleridge's poem Dejection, which, by the way, would make an interesting point of convergence for those three texts in an essay question, describing his grief without a pang, void, dark, and drear, a drowsy, stifled, unimpassioned grief which finds no natural outlet or relief in word or sigh or tear. So let's go on. He talks about the fact that he could find nothing that made him feel better and that he had no relief from his depression. He explains his state of suffering by believing that ultimately analysis, while it provides a good basis for rational decision making, also wears away the feelings, and left to itself without any support, the feelings ultimately become useless. And in this section, he actually echoes something that John Henry Cardinal Newman says in his discussion about the basis of faith and how analysis can actually wear away at faith and belief. He says, "My course of study had led me to believe that all mental and moral feelings and qualities, whether of a good or bad kind, were the results of association, that we love one thing and hate another, take pleasure in one sort of action or contemplation, and pain in another sort, through the clinging of pleasurable or painful ideas to those things from the effect of education or experience." And remember, Wordsworth talked also about the ideas of association based in Hartleyan psychology of the period. As a corollary from this, I had always heard it maintained by my father, and was myself convinced that the object of education should be to form the strongest possible associations of the salutary class, associations of pleasure with all things beneficial to the great whole, and of pain with all things hurtful to it. This doctrine appeared inexpugnable, but now it seemed to me, on retrospect, that my teachers had occupied themselves but superficially with the means of forming and keeping up these salutary associations. They seem to have trusted altogether to the old familiar instruments, praise and blame, reward and punishment. Now I did not doubt that by these means, begun early and applied unremittingly, intense associations of pain and pleasure, especially of pain, might be created and might produce desires and aversions capable of lasting undiminished to the end of life. But there must always be something artificial and casual in associations thus produced. The pains and pleasures thus forcibly associated with the things are not connected with them by any natural tie, and it is, therefore, I thought, essential to the durability of these associations that they should have become so intense and inveterate as to be practically indissoluble before the habitual exercise of the power of analysis had commenced. For now I saw, or I thought I saw, what I had always before received with incredulity, that the habit of analysis has a tendency to wear away the feelings, as indeed it has when no other mental habit is cultivated, and the analyzing spirit remains without its natural complements and correctives. So, he's saying that unless there is something to counterbalance the effect of reason and analysis, some other mental habit is cultivated, then analysis remains without its natural complements and correctives and destroys the feelings. The very excellence of analysis, argued, is that it tends to weaken and undermine what is the result of prejudice, that allows us mentally to separate ideas which have only casually clung together, and no associations whatever could ultimately resist this dissolving force, were it not that we owe to our analysis clearest knowledge of the permanent sequences in nature, the real connections between things, not dependent on our will and feelings, natural laws by virtue of which in many cases one thing is inseparable from another in fact. Which laws, in proportion as they are clearly perceived and imaginatively realized, cause our idea of things which are always joined together in nature to cohere more and more closely in our thoughts. Analytic habits may thus even strengthen the associations between causes and effects, means and ends, but tend altogether to weaken those which are, to speak familiarly, a mere matter of feeling. They are, therefore, I thought, favorable to prudence and clear-sightedness, but a perpetual worm at the root of both the passions and of the virtues, and above all, fearfully undermine all desires and all pleasures which are the effects of associations. That is, according to the theory I held, all except the purely physical and organic, of the entire insufficiency of which to make life desirable. No one had a stronger conviction than I had. He is claiming that Analysis, while it is beneficial to find reasons for behavior, destroys the emotional motivation for behavior because it destroys accidental associations between pleasurable feelings and abstract concepts. So, according to the theory that Mill had at the time, analysis will destroy all associations which are not the results of, as he says, purely physical and organic associations, which are natural associations. Those associations, which are the result of the permanent sequences in nature, the real connections between things not dependent on our will and feelings, natural laws by virtue of which, in many cases, one thing is inseparable from another in fact. So, those things which are not associated with the real connections between things are going to be dissolved by analysis. And the only ones that are based upon the natural associations, the real connections between things, are the purely physical and organic. So those things that are based upon natural associations, like candy tastes good and sticking your hand in the fire hurts, are going to be dissolved, which means that associations that are purely abstract, like the associations of one's happiness with the welfare of mankind, will not hold up to analysis because the welfare of mankind in the long run does not provide anyone with immediate physical pleasure. And so that kind of association will suffer when you subject it to analysis. So what Mill needs is some means of promoting abstract associations which are not based upon natural physical sensations. So let's scroll down to a passage farther on down on page 105 and how Mill discovers that there is something other than simply analysis or reason that has a value in human motivation. He says at the top of 105, I was reading, accidentally, Marmontel's memoir and came to the passage which relates to his father's death, the distressed position of the family, and the sudden inspiration by which he, then a mere boy, felt and made them feel that he would be everything to them, would supply the place of all that they had lost. I find it perhaps not surprising or incidental that Mill, the son of a very forceful father, would find sympathy with taking his father's place. A vivid conception of this scene and its feelings came over me, and I was moved to tears. From this moment, my burden grew lighter. The oppression of the thought that all feeling was dead within me was gone. I was no longer hopeless. I was not a stock or a stone. He compares his discovery that there is some motivation other than pure reason with the anti-self-consciousness theory of Carlyle. He says, the experience of this period had two very marked effects on my opinions and character. In the first place, they led me to adopt a theory of life very unlike that on which I had before acted, and having much in common with what at the time I had certainly never heard of, the anti-self-consciousness theory of Carlyle. Remember renunciation and Insagen. I had never indeed wavered in the conviction that happiness is the test of all rules of conduct and the end of life, but I now thought that this end was only to be attained by not making it the direct end. Those are only happy, I thought, who have their minds fixed on some object other than their own happiness, on the happiness of others, on the improvement of mankind, even on some art or pursuit, followed not as a means, but as itself an ideal end. Aiming thus at something else, they find happiness by the way. The enjoyments of life, such was now my theory, are sufficient to make it a pleasant thing when they are taken en passant, without being made a principal object. Once make them so, and they are immediately felt to be insufficient. They will not bear a scrutinizing examination. Ask yourself whether you are happy and you cease to be so. The only chance is to treat not happiness, but some end external to it as the purpose of life. Let your self-consciousness, your scrutiny, your self-interrogation exhaust themselves on that, and if otherwise fortunately circumstanced, you will inhale happiness with the air you breathe, without dwelling on it or thinking about it, without either forestalling it in imagination or putting it to flight by fatal questioning. This theory now became the basis of my philosophy of life. So, similarly to Carlyle, if you try to make yourself happy, the moment you ask yourself, am I happy? The answer to that question is irrepressibly no, because it immediately evokes all of the things that you don't have to make you happy. But if you place your interest in something other than your direct personal happiness, then your happiness comes through the achievement of that external end. And interestingly enough, although they come to it from very different directions, it is very similar to Carlyle's notion of renunciation of self in favor of action or work on something else. So although Carlyle and Mill are very definitely different in their basis of philosophy, the transcendental versus the rational empirical philosophy, nevertheless, they ultimately come to the same notion that one should reject the pursuit of one's own happiness as an ideal end and put the achievement of something else as one's end, and one will achieve what Carlyle calls blessedness, what Mill calls happiness, by that means. This will also color, to some extent, Mill's description of utility in his essay Utilitarianism, which becomes based not on achieving one's own happiness, but the greatest good of the greatest number, even if that means sacrificing one's own happiness. So that's his first recognition. His first recognition resulting from his depression is that one's own happiness cannot be made one's end, but rather something else must be made one's end, and one finds happiness in the achievement of that end. His second recognition has to do with the discovery of poetry. He says, "The other important change which my opinions at this time underwent was that I for the first time gave its proper place among the prime necessities of human being to the internal culture of the individual. I ceased to attach almost exclusive importance to the ordering of outward circumstances and the training of the human being for speculation and for action." So now he's going to give importance to training one's internal culture, and in this case particularly the feelings. You skip down a paragraph. "I now began to find meaning in the things which I had read or heard about, the importance of poetry and art as instruments of human culture." And so he turns to culture and he finds several different poets completely unsatisfying and artists, until on page 107 he finds Wordsworth. "This state of my thoughts and feelings made the fact of my reading Wordsworth for the first time in the autumn of 1828 an important event of my life." And he picks up Wordsworth and begins reading his poems. Some of them he finds useful, some of them he doesn't. But the ones that he values, he says, helped because they provided what he was looking for, a very culture of the feelings, a development of his internal culture. What made Wordsworth's poems a medicine for my state of mind was that they expressed not mere outward beauty, but states of feeling, and of thought colored by feeling under the excitement of beauty. They seemed to be the very culture of the feelings, which I was in quest of. In them I seemed to draw from a source of inward joy, of sympathetic and imaginative pleasure, which could be shared in by all human beings, which had no connection with struggle or imperfection, but would be made richer by every improvement in the physical or social condition of mankind. From there I seemed to learn what would be the perennial sources of happiness, when all the graters of evil of life shall be removed, and I felt myself at once better and happier as I came under their influence. There have certainly been, even in our own age, greater poets than Wordsworth, but poetry of deeper and loftier feeling could not have done for me at that time what his did." Interestingly enough, Bentham's rejection of poetry is remedied by Wordsworth's desire, expressed in the preface and exemplified in Tintern Abbey, to find in the still sad music of humanity the nurse, the guide, the guardian of my heart and soul of all my moral being, for Mill also. And that brings us to Mill's essay, What is Poetry? And his celebration of poetry in contradiction to Benthamite philosophy, that poetry is useless, a mere matter of feelings, which has no more significance than a child's game like pushpin. In his essay, What is Poetry?, starting on page 74 of the Norton Anthology, he follows a Socratic method in order to achieve a definition of poetry by differentiating it from all of those things which are not poetry. He begins by distinguishing poetry from science. So if we scroll down to the bottom of page 74, he says, "The object of poetry is confessedly to act upon the emotions, and therein is poetry sufficiently distinguished from what Wordsworth affirms to be its logical opposite, namely not prose but matter-of-fact or science." So he gets Wordsworth right in one way, in which he attributes to Wordsworth the belief that poetry acts on the elementary passions and primary feelings.
But he gets Wordsworth wrong in one very important other way.
Because Wordsworth does not distinguish poetry from science, but says that poetry actually is a kind of science. Science meaning knowledge, scientia in Latin. So Mill's first goal is to distinguish poetry from science. He says, the one addresses itself to belief, the other to the feelings. The one does its work by convincing or persuading, the other by moving. The one acts by presenting a proposition to the understanding, the other by offering interesting objects of contemplation to the sensibilities. Now that he has distinguished poetry from science, he's going to have to narrow it down because, of course, poetry is a production in language, so he has to distinguish it from other kinds of production in language. And the first one he's going to distinguish it from is narrative.
By which he means particularly novels.
He says, many of the greatest poems are in the form of fictitious narratives. And in almost all good serious fiction, there is true poetry. But there is a radical distinction between the interest in a story felt as such and the interest excited by poetry, for the one is derived from incident, the other from the representation of feeling. A non-poetic narrative is one where the interest evolves from the plot, from what happens, from tracing the incidents. A poem, or poetry for Mill, whether in narrative prose or in meter, derives from the fact that the principal goal of the poem is to convey states of feeling. That's Mill's concept.
Based, of course, on the focus and purpose of poetry according to Wordsworth.
In one, the source of emotion excited is the exhibition of a state or states of human sensibility. In the other, of a series of states of mere outward circumstances. So after Mill distinguishes poetry from science, he then starts to distinguish poetry from other forms of linguistic production. First, narrative. By the way, I just have to call your attention to the bottom of page 75, where he echoes Jane Austen's satirical discussion about novel reading. He says, the greatest minds find their satisfaction in poetry. The shallowest and emptiest, on the contrary, are at all events not those at least addicted to novel reading. Now, by limiting the emphasis of poetry to emotion and to the truth of emotion, Mill begins his implicit process of devaluing poetry.
Although he himself doesn't see it that way, he believes that he is bringing poetry back from Bentham's attack, and he is, but he is doing it in a very limited fashion.
Remember that for Shelley and for Wordsworth and for the other Romantic poets, poetry reveals truth, which reason then plays with later. Poetry is the access to truth. Mill, although he believes he is following in his mentor Wordsworth's steps, is actually devaluing poetry. And we can see the process of devaluation starting at the top of page 76. He says, but poetry, which is the delineation of the deeper and more secret workings of human emotion, is interesting only to those to whom it recalls what they have felt, or those whose imagination it stirs up to conceive what they could feel, or what they might have been able to feel had their outward circumstances been different. Poetry, when it is really such, is truth, and fiction also, if it's good for anything, is truth, but they are different truths. The truth of poetry is to paint the human soul truly. The truth of fiction is to give a true picture of life. The two kinds of knowledge are different and come by different ways, come mostly to different persons. And then he goes on to say, great poets are often proverbially ignorant of life. And so poetry is not about real circumstances, it's about real feeling. What that also does is it limits poetry's scope. Poetry no longer provides access to whole and universal truth. It now provides truth to a very specific segment of human experience, which is deep passion and emotion. At the bottom of page 77, he makes a distinction between poetry and description. He says, in limiting poetry to the delineation of states of feeling and denying the name where nothing is delineated by outward objects, we may be thought to have done what we promised to avoid, to have not found but made a definition in opposition to the use of language, since it is established by common consent that all poetry can be called descriptive. So description, he says, is not poetic in and of itself. It's only poetic when description, as in Wordsworth's imbuing external nature with human emotion, becomes descriptive. At that point, Wordsworth's landscape poetry, which ultimately is not aiming at the landscape, but aiming at the human emotion imbued upon the landscape and revealing what the poet feels and seeing the landscape, think of Tintern Abbey again. That's what the true nature of poetry is for Mill. But if you skip down to page 77, one of the things this reveals is where Mill starts to limit poetry's scope in a significant way. Descriptive poetry consists, no doubt, in description, but in descriptions of things as they appear, not as they are. And it paints them not in their bare and natural lineaments, but seen through the medium and arrayed in the colors of the imagination, set in action by the feelings. You can actually hear him echoing the preface, Wordsworth's preface, at this point. The imagination set in action by the feelings is a line taken directly from Wordsworth. Mill believes himself to be celebrating Wordsworth. He believes himself to be acknowledging the power and importance of poetry, and he believes himself to be rebelling in some way against Bentham and the other Benthamites. And in fact, Bentham and the other Benthamites, well, Bentham's dead at this point, but the other Benthamites believe that Mill is rebelling and rejecting the basic tenets of their philosophical creed. But in fact, when he lets poetry back in, he lets it in a very backhanded way. He says, if a poet describes a lion, he does not describe him as a naturalist would, nor even as a traveler would, who is intent upon stating the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And notice here that he's quoting from courtroom language, was intent on stating the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. He describes him by imagery, that is, by suggesting the most striking likenesses and contrasts which might occur to a mind contemplating a lion in the state of awe, wonder, or terror, which the spectacle naturally excites, or is on the occasion supposed to excite. Now this is describing the lion professedly, but the state of excitement of the spectator really. The lion may be described falsely or with exaggeration, and the poetry be all the better. But if the human emotion be not painted with scrupulous truth, the poetry is bad poetry, i.e. it is not poetry at all, but a failure. If one wants to find the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, one goes to a naturalist. If one wants to find the truth of feeling, then one goes to a poet. But what this ends up doing in a very significant way is turning poetry into a source of subjective truth. In other words, it's not truth at all. It's the truth of that individual person at that particular time, which is very different from what Wordsworth and Shelley and Keats believe poetry did. Wordsworth and Shelley and Keats believed that poetry gave us absolute eternal truth. The Romantics believed that poetry and the imagination revealed truths. Think of Percy Shelley's defense of poetry, which then were manipulated by those who came after, primarily those people who used their reason to examine the truths revealed by poetry. Mill is letting poetry back in, but he's letting it in as a source of subjective truth, not objective reality. Farther down the same page, Mill contrasts poetry with eloquence. Eloquence is supposed to evoke emotion, but Mill makes the distinction that eloquence is there to achieve some other effect. It's rhetoric, language attempted to persuade people. Mill, following Percy Shelley's idea of the poet as nightingale singing to himself in darkness, suggests that poetry is not heard but overheard. He says, eloquence as well as poetry is impassioned truth. Eloquence as well as poetry is thoughts colored by the feelings. Yet common apprehension and philosophic criticism alike recognize a distinction between the two. There is much that everyone would call eloquence, which no one would think of classing as poetry. Poetry and eloquence are both alike in the expression or utterance of feeling. But if we may be excused the antithesis, we should say that eloquence is heard, poetry is overheard. Eloquence supposes an audience. The peculiarity of poetry appears to us to lie in the poet's utter unconsciousness of a listener. Poetry is feeling confessing itself to itself in moments of solitude and embodying itself in symbols which are the nearest possible representations of the feeling in the exact shape in which it exists in the poet's mind. Eloquence is feeling pouring itself out to other minds, courting their sympathy or endeavoring to influence their belief or move them to passion or action. All poetry is of the nature of soliloquy. So Mill has adopted what he believes is the romantic notion of the function of poetry for itself. But in doing so, he's let poetry back into the canon, as it were, in a very backhanded sort of way, which now admits that it is truth, but it's only subjective truth. It doesn't reveal all truths, but only the truths of how people feel.
Just as Mill modified Bentham's original concept of poetry, Mill also modifies Bentham's concept of utilitarianism, taking it from something based upon the direct physical pleasure or pain of the individual to a more abstract notion of pleasure or pain based upon identification with the well-being of others. And this modification of utilitarianism to Mill's version of Utilitarianism 2.0 becomes the basis of the convergence between Mill's notion of morality based upon the common good and the version that's represented by Dickens in A Christmas Carol. So next, we will be looking at Mill's description of utilitarianism in his pamphlet of that title.